Hello again and welcome back. In this section we're going to look at charts and graphs that show relationships. And the data we're going to use to begin with are some data on the sales of insurance policies for the Las Vegas branch of a particular insurance company. Data are here in this sheet. I have 2 years worth of data covering 2008-2009, and I have a season column that I'll talk about later on, a column that contains the number of inquiries, and a column that contains the number of policies sold. And we're going to start to look at the relationships between these variables. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to create a scatter chart for this data. And the data I'm going to use to begin with are the months and the number of inquiries. So having selected those two sets of data, click on Insert, click on Scatter, and I'm basically going to draw a scatter with only markers. And there we are. Now of course the scatter chart I'm drawing here is really showing a trend over time, and I can format this scatter chart using all the normal tools available to me. Let's have a quick run through of those. On the Design tab we have alternative layouts, so we can choose to have title, both axis titles and legend with that first option, and then the other options gives us different combinations of those things. Obviously we can go in, change our axis titles and so on. And as you can tell from the points in the scatter chart, there seems to be a general upward trend in the number of inquiries at this branch over the period that we're looking at, which is a period of 2 years. But in fact it's not trend that I want to look at now, it's relationship. And what I'm trying to do is to identify the pattern that there is in these inquiries at the insurance office. Now clearly they're tending to increase over time, but what are the other dependencies? What are the other ways in which these vary? Now what I'm going to do is select the chart, just delete it, and go back to the data and just look at the data again. One of the things that I suspect is that there is a relationship between the number of inquiries and the time of year. So we've already seen that there's a general tendency for inquiries to increase over time, but is there some kind of pattern within a year which makes a particular part or parts of a year more busy than others? So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to draw a new scatter chart, but this time I'm going to plot season of the year against inquiries. Now season of the year can be defined in a number of ways. The way I'm going to define it here is I'm going to define it by month numbers. So I've written a little formula using the function month, which for instance here says the month for Jan 08 is 1 because it's the month in cell A2, which is Jan 08, and then I've filled that formula down the whole of this column to give me the seasons, which obviously go from 1 to 12 right down to the end of 2009. So let's select all the data, insert, scatter. We're going to do a simple scatter chart again. Let's see what we get this time. Now what we get this time is a very different picture, because we're now plotting what is effectively month number from 1 to 12 against number of inquiries. It's a bit more difficult to see a general pattern, although we can see that in December, for instance, we tend to get more inquiries than we get in January. Now I'm not going to format this chart just now, we'll come back to that a little bit later on. What I am going to do though is I'm going to go to the Layout tab and select trend line, because I'm going to put a trend line onto this scatter chart, and I'm going to start with a linear trend line. Now, what Excel 2010 does is to use a mathematical formula to place a trend line onto my graph. And it will always put a line. What that line is trying to do is to show me whether there is a relationship between the two variables that are plotted. And the two variables I've got plotted are, of course, the number of inquiries and the season of the year, specifically the month of the year. And if the line goes from down on the left to up on the right, it is very likely that the two variables are related in a positive way. What that means is that as one increases, the other increases, which loosely speaking means that the lowest number of inquiries is early in the year, the higher number later in the year. If the line went down from left to right, then we would say that the variables are inversely related. So we do seem to have what is called a direct relationship between the number of inquiries and the month. And in order to quantify that, we can go back to the trend line button again and look at more trend line options. Now on this we have two options at the bottom, which we're going to look at in a moment, but you may recognize part of this. It's very similar to the forecasting we had when we put a trend line on much earlier on, and indeed we can with scatter charts use these for forecasting, which we'll look at later on. We can name the trend line and so on. But the two things we're interested in at the moment particularly are the bottom two, one of which is display equation on chart and one of which is display R-squared value on chart. Now these two actually define the relationship between the two variables. Now unfortunately it's going to refer to our vertical variable as y and our horizontal variable as x, and what it says is that the relationship, such as it is that y is just over 6 times x plus about 105. The R-squared value is referred to as the correlation coefficient, and that correlation coefficient tells you how closely related the two variables are. And if the correlation coefficient is close to 1 or -1, it indicates that the two variables are actually very strongly related. In a case of a direct relation it will be positive, so we'd be looking for a value near +1. In the case of an inverse relationship it will be negative, so we'll be looking for a value near -1. Now a value of 0.315 is not a particularly strong correlation, so although there is a relationship, it's not a very strong or convincing one. Now once again I'm going to delete this chart, go back to my source data, and this time again I'm going to draw a different chart, and this time the chart that I'm going to draw is going to be a chart comparing the number of inquiries with the number of policies sold. So select that data, insert scatter, same sort of scatter chart, increase it in size, and again go to the layout tab, choose trend line options. I'm going to choose a linear trend line. I'm going to name the trend line this time and call it policies versus inquiries, and I'm going to display the equation and display the R-squared. Let's see what we get. Now again I've got a formula. Y is 0.1869x plus 9, and the R-squared value indicates that there isn't a particularly strong relationship between the number of inquiries and the number of policies sold, which is probably quite worrying from a selling point of view, because you think that if you deal with your inquiries efficiently, you should be making more sales when you get more inquiries. So that would be quite disappointing. Now, while we've got this particular scatter diagram on the screen, let's look at the alternatives as far as scatter diagrams are concerned. Go back to the Design tab, change chart type. With scatter, the options we have are the one we've got already, which is scatter with only markers, scatter with smooth lines and markers. Now, in the case of this sort of data, the smooth lines don't really add anything much for us. These don't imply any kind of sequence or relationship between those. Again, change chart type again. We can have a scatter with smooth lines and no markers. We can have a scatter with straight lines and markers, scatter with just straight lines. So just to show you the last one to see what it's like. Again, in this particular case, that isn't really going to do anything for us. So once we've got our scatter chart and we've got our formula and coefficient, we can actually put those somewhere else on the chart if we want to, and then we could actually set about formatting this chart. So we go into the title. I'm going to change the title to policies sold compared to inquiries. I'm going to look at the possible chart layouts up here because I actually want everything on here. I want the title, both axis titles, and a legend, so that's the first option for me. I'm going to change the vertical axis title to policies sold. Tick there. Select the horizontal axis title, inquiries received. And what I'm going to actually do now is say this is not a time-based chart. I'm not talking about time going that way. I'm saying that as the number of inquiries increases, generally speaking, the number of policies sold increases. But I can still use the principle of the trend line to do some forecasting. So for instance, suppose that I wanted to see, based on the best fit line here, how many inquiries I would need to get to, say, sell 100 policies in a month. What I can do is I can go back to the Layout tab, put the trend line on there. I'm going to stick with the linear trend line, and I'm going to go into more trend line options. Now I'm going to change the trend line name, which I've typed in there, policies versus inquiries. I want to see the equation, I want to see the R-squared value, but I am going to forecast forward, say, let's say 200 periods, so that's 200 inquiries. Let's say 250 inquiries and see how it looks. Now when I do that, notice what happens. The trend line is extended. It's still based on the existing data, but it's extended forward, and in fact, quite fortunately for me, with 500 inquiries, the trend line indicates that I will sell 100 policies. And one of the things I need to bear in mind with this is how confident I am in that figure. Now an R-squared value of 0.26 is not particularly convincing and not something I'd put an awful lot of weight in, but it's all I've got at the moment. So that would be a reasonable target to aim at and give me a good idea of how many inquiries I would need to get in a particular month to sell 100 policies. So in this section we've looked at how to build a scatter diagram, how to format it, and how to use it to identify a relationship between variables and to use it to forecast. In the next section we're going to continue to look at relationships, and we're going to look at some of the other major options available to show these via graphs and charts in Excel 2010. I'll see you then.